Hello, welcome to Mapping Global China Conversations, a series of interviews hosted by the Mapping Global China project. Our initiative combines data visualization and digital storytelling to track and better understand China's global footprint across a wide range of sectors. Today, we are honored to be joined by Professor Ji Li, the John Marilyn Lange Professor of U.S.-China Business and Law at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Li is a leading expert in Chinese law and politics, international business transactions, and comparative legal studies. His work examines how Chinese companies navigate U.S. legal institutions and how global legal actors respond to the intensifying U.S.-China geopolitical tensions. And his recent book, Negotiating Legality, and also his previous book, Clash of Capitalism, both published by Cambridge University Press, shed light on the complex intersections of law, capital, and power. And we are so happy to speak with him today about the evolving legal landscapes that shape global China and also in this really critical moment. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
My first question is, I know that you are trained in both political science and law and worked at a top New York law firm before becoming a scholar. So what drew you to research Chinese companies abroad, and how has your own journey shaped this kind of questions that you ask today in your books?
Yeah, so during my work, I was a lawyer for a couple of years and practiced law in New York. So I worked with a lot of multinational corporations. And so they kept asking me questions about, this complex regulatory and legal environment and how they navigate this whole messy complex. And, sometimes I could find legal answers, but sometimes, the more interesting, important questions are hidden, right? There are no easy answers, at least not in the law. So once I joined the legal academia, I thought I should further explore those questions, look behind those the technical legal questions, and try to find patterns, try to find more profound explanations. So that's drawn me to start to explore this set of questions, but gradually, right, I found relatively niche area of research that is, transnational actors in this global context, especially Chinese transnational actors, Chinese multinational companies, Chinese immigrants. So topics about those transnational actors just fascinates me. So I started to explore those questions. So I wrote 2 books on Chinese multinational companies. And right now I'm working on a series of projects exploring Chinese immigrant lawyers. There's very little about immigrant lawyers, but they are growing in number very fast. And Chinese immigrant lawyers are the largest ethnic group among all immigrant lawyers in the U.S. So, but we know nothing about them. So I'm also working on a series of projects studying this group.
And also I like how you talked about when we talk about law, we talk about practice, right? But you theorize the practice and put them into a more profound light so that we could understand the mechanism behind those practices.
Yeah. There's, division of labor, right? Lawyers gave legal answers and scholars tried to find the patterns and try to find more the underlying logic behind behind legal answers. Yeah.
Both kind of sides.
That's I think the work experience helped me see questions that legal academia scholars, law scholars sometimes miss, especially if you look at the mainstream debates in legal academia. Most of them revolve around questions about U.S. companies, U.S. persons, and U.S. entities, right? I think the debate or the research in those areas has plateaued, right? They have exhausted most of the interesting questions, but there's very little about transnational actors. So I think that's where I can contribute.
Yeah, and also here in Shanghai, I meet with some of the small business owners and people who really want to go out to go out to the sea, to explore the market, for instance, in the US. So your recent book, Negotiating Legality, it explores how Chinese companies really navigate the legal systems in the US. So could you share a little bit about this book and the main argument you're making?
So this book is about how Chinese multinationals in the US try to navigate the complex U.S. legal system. The U.S. legal system is entirely different from the Chinese one. So for Chinese managers, Chinese investors, to be able to adapt, there's a very steep learning curve, right? They have to deal with. So basically, the question was, how do they do it? Are they able to do it? I mean, what are the implications? So then it's a very big topic, right? You have to break that down. So I broke that down into a series of questions, right? Whether or not they develop internal legal capacity, how do they interact with U.S. lawyers, right? Because you can't really navigate the U.S. legal system without the assistance of lawyers. And then if they have legal conflicts, how do they resolve them, right? Who gets to make the decisions? And to what extent do they rely on lawyers? And if they are mistreated by the U.S. government, which is increasingly possible, how do they do, right? How do they cope? Do they go to court? I mean, that's a possible option, but do they do that? And in China, litigating against the government is not a winning strategy, right? But in the U.S., that's a possibility, right? So do they do that? And how well do they do in courts when they have to challenge a U.S. government body? Yeah, the book just includes all those questions. I propose a coherent theoretical framework, which I call a dual institutionalist framework. So I argue that if we want to understand how Chinese multinationals adapt to the U.S. legal system or fail to adapt to it, you have to look at both their host state institutional environment, the U.S. context, as well as the home state institutional context, the Chinese culture, the Chinese social norms, the Chinese laws and regulations. And all those may impact how managers who reside in the U.S., who make decisions in the U.S., the home state institutional influence directly or indirectly will shape their decision making. So that's my proposed framework. Yeah, so I hope this overarching framework will help us understand all the discrete topics.
Yeah, and also for practitioners in the field, they would know at least there is a theory and a mechanism in the institutional kind of side of things.
Right. So I think for a U.S. lawyer to competently advise a Chinese client, the lawyer should have some understanding of Chinese law and regulations. Otherwise, they won't be able to properly or adequately advise their clients. Yeah.
And so this is a fascinating book. It covers so many aspects of the legal field. So is there a case in your research or a material that you kind of gathered that is really surprising for you?
Yeah, I was surprised at how much the home state institutions continue to shape the decision making on the ground in the U.S. Right? Some companies, when they have legal trouble in the U.S., instead of resolving it, within the local U.S. context, they would write up a report, send it back to the headquarters, and wait for instructions.
Okay.
And the headquarters in China,
Okay.
right? So, but then the decision makers in China, they don't have much knowledge about the U.S. law, U.S. regulations, the U.S. legal and political context. They make their decision based on their understanding of how things are, or should be. And so they basically project their imagination of the U.S. Onto the decisions. And so I was surprised how often that's the case.
Yeah, this is a true surprising finding.
Yeah,
and I would definitely recommend your book to the business owners who want to go outside.
Right.
They really should read your book to avoid some of the
Right.
pitfalls.
Unless the headquarters, unless the managers at headquarters sufficient knowledge about the U.S., they shouldn't intervene too much. Right? They should defer to the local managers on many of the concrete or technical issues.
And also, I know you might say that you're not an expert, but you have predicted the new changes in the U.S. tariff kind of situation. So the next question would be like, how have higher U.S. tariffs affected the way Chinese companies operate and also their decisions about selling products or investing in the United States?
In the end, it's a business decision, right? You do the cost and benefit analysis. Right? On the one hand, you invest in the U.S., you produce in the U.S., you avoid the tariffs. Yeah. But on the other hand, operating in the U.S. is very costly. Labor is very expensive in the U.S. Yeah. And increasingly, the U.S. regulatory environment is very hostile towards Chinese investors. Mm-hmm. Of course, if you have good lawyers, you can find a way to mitigate that risk.
The advice would be to find a good lawyer.
Right. If you want to do business in the U.S., you can't do it without legal assistance. So finding a trustworthy, competent lawyer who knows your company, who understands the Chinese context, is crucial. So that's benefits and potential downside of investing in the U.S., producing in the U.S. But if continue to produce in China, then export to the U.S., you face this uncertainty of tariffs, right? Increasing tariffs in the future. I mean, U.S.-China relations is now very volatile. Right, so that's a risk you have to take into account when you make that business decision. I think in the future, there will continue to be Chinese. You probably see more and more Chinese investors invest in the U.S. But my book will explain a lot of the risks and possible pitfalls for Chinese companies operating in the U.S.
So the next question would be a little bit about your original areas of expertise, political science. So the current situation is really a new world for me. So some would say it's the new U.S. regulations. They aim to protect national security, and some would say it's economic protectionism. So how do you interpret from previous legal, political scientist perspective, how would you interpret these changes and how would you kind of predict where the future would be like?
Yeah, so the U.S. and China are locked in this rivalry. I don't see any way out in the near future. So that's become a bipartisan consensus that treats China as an existential threat to the U.S. Yeah, I think, my view is a lot of this portrait of China's national security threat is really been abused by U.S. politicians, right? I think if I have to, I'm leaning towards viewing all this as protectionism. You can look at the timing, right? Once Huawei became a real competitor of some of the U.S. companies, then it suddenly became a national security threat. And this is not new, right? Back in the 1980s, Japanese companies were treated similarly. So now the focus is on China. So of course, there may be some constituencies in the U.S. who sincerely consider China to be a critical threat, but I think the vast majority of the politicians just want to use China as a way to raise support, get enough votes, and I mean, domestically in the U.S., you see a polarization, right? There's wealth gap just keeps widening, and probably need external factor, right? Someone to point finger at, so that will divert the attention and also to rally some support. I mean, these days it's hard for Republican and Democrat to agree on anything except on China. So I think at a certain level, the U.S. Elite probably understand that they need China, they need the external enemy,
Yes.
right, to get domestic things in order, right? So, but in the end, it's very complex matter. But we saw this in 1980s, right, early 1990s, when Japan rose and were deemed to be a potential competitor. And now China has assumed that role. The U.S. no longer pay attention to Japan simply because its economy relatively has declined and is no longer posing that serious challenge. But China, is still a developing country. There's still a lot of space for China to grow. So China is not going anywhere, right? It's going away anytime soon. So I think the rivalry will continue in the near future.
So TikTok, I'm always curious. There are so many information about TikTok, and for me, it's kind of like just this fog of information. And then it kind of, the case of TikTok really touches upon a lot of different topics like the data control, digital platform, and also the global influence of Chinese companies today. So from a true expert's perspective, are there any insiders insight or some insiders information that you want to share with us about the TikTok case?
Well, I'm not an insider, so I don't have insiders information, but I did pay a lot of attention to this case. My book does include some discussion about TikTok, right? As a company that's legally speaking, it's not a Chinese company, right? But it's controlled by Zhang Yiming, right? It's controlled by this Chinese citizen. So that's why it's labeled as a Chinese company. Yeah, and it fits my definition of Chinese company. So my book discusses this case. Initially, right, it challenged when Trump issued an executive order to ban TikTok and WeChat. They challenged that order in courts, and eventually it prevailed, right? It prevailed, and then the state government of Montana banned TikTok in the entire state. And that decision was also challenged in court, and also TikTok prevailed. So it has been quite successful in U.S. courts, but then it got the attention of Congress, and then that changed once Congress passed a law to ban TikTok. That changed the whole dynamic, right? The court's analysis entirely shifted. It's no longer about the limit of executive power. It's more about separation of powers and freedoms. How freedom of speech, how a law that restrain freedom of speech should be analyzed in the context of separation of powers, in the context of judicial deference to the other branches. So in the end, the Supreme Court ruled against the TikTok. So now it's really up for Trump, right, to decide when TikTok has to be sold and to whom it will be sold. But it's no longer a legal question. Now it's a political question, right? I'm sure the decision will be made with both the U.S. and Chinese governments involved. So the takeaway from this case is that once you are a high-profile company, you are part of this geopolitical dynamic, right? There's very little control. Either the owner or the manager of this global company with Chinese roots, there's very little you can control, right? You are part of this geopolitical confrontation. In other words, in the future, I see it's really difficult to be a global digital company.
Wow, that's such an interesting comment.
Right.
Thought about it.
Yeah. So.
And also because we are mapping global China, so we talk about the concept of global China a lot. And even though we know that a lot of things are being more compartmentalized, regionalized, but we still want to think about China as kind of reaching out to different parts of the world, either through the BRI projects or through investment and building factories in the US, right, by Chinese companies. So in your perspective, a legal scholar's perspective, what does the concept of global China, because I was asked a lot, what does global China mean for you? What does it refer to? So for you, from your perspective, what does global China refer to?
Yeah, well, I tend to disaggregate this very broad concept. To me, I focus on the actors. Global China, to me, is really the stories of Chinese transnational actors. Yeah. So it's fascinating, right? If you look at Chinese multinational companies doing business in the U.S., in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, either they adapt or they fail to adapt, or Chinese immigrants, right? Chinese move abroad to the U.S., to Southeast Asia, Latin America, how they try to thrive in the local environment. So to me, global China is really hundreds of thousands of stories of Chinese transnational actors.
I really like this answer. It's not an abstract idea of global China, but it's stories, it's lived experiences of people and also companies and also their mobilizations around the globe.
Right.
That's a great answer. But I'm also curious because you just mentioned that for Chinese companies, sometimes when they encounter something challenging, they would turn back to their Chinese court for some advice or some institutional support. So my question is China, because when we talk about global China, we tend to think about China's increased influence in different aspects, right, in the global world. What is China's role in international law? Is China reshaping some of the norms, or is China becoming a more prominent figure in this international legal community?
Right. Recently, I have been working on that topic. My argument is that China is making some incremental changes to global or transnational legal orders. But if you look at what happened in China in the past few decades, right? China has really embraced international legal order and legal norms. There are many reasons. One being, in the post-Cultural Revolution era, China strategically joined the global order, right? The entry of the WTO, right? And also, the first thing the Chinese government did right after the Cultural Revolution was sending hundreds of Chinese to study in the U.S. and in other OECD countries. And these students, after they went back to China, they took important roles in the Chinese government, in the educational system. They become institutional carriers, right? They invested so heavily in the existing US-led global order So they become a part of it. If you look at some of the top universities, especially the business schools, most of the faculty members got their PhDs in the US, right? They become invested in the US-led system, and that has not changed that much, right? So today, China is making incremental changes to the order because the Chinese, ruling elites, they are part of this existing system. They make incremental changes, and that's all they are capable of doing, or they are motivated to do. So it's my argument that in the near future, I don't think China will want to revise the system or radically change the existing transnational orders. I think the Chinese government has invested so heavily in this system and has benefited from the system. So I don't think it want to overthrow the system. But ironically, the U.S. government is doing that, right? So but in some areas, Chinese parties as institutional carriers may moderately change the existing rules. Their preference for while settling disputes may affect how transnational disputes are resolved. But if you look at the picture from a 3,000 feet bird's eye view, that I don't think China wants to radically change the existing rules.
They have invested so much for such a long time.
Right, and it's hard for them to imagine an alternative system, right? Because they have learned their craft within this existing system, so they cannot think out of the box. What's happening right now is quite surprising, right? There have been talks in the past that China is the revisionist of power, but it turns out that the U.S. is the revisionist of power. But we are in a very interesting time.
In this interesting time, if a Chinese firm is still going to the US to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange to invest in the US, what would be the most important piece of legal advice? What other advice do you have for those type of companies?
I can't give legal advice, my advice is don't underestimate geopolitical risk, right? Just make sure that they consult lawyers, of course, but also they should take into consideration potential geopolitical risks given the U.S.-China relations. Most business people are very optimistic, right? They are entrepreneurs because they tend to be risk seeking, right? They underestimate risk, including legal and regulatory risk, but most of them don't take into consideration political risk. But I think they should, given the current situation. They should factor the political risk into their cost-benefit analysis, right? Previously, it's such a small but highly consequential risk. People tend to ignore it, just like earthquake, right? And people buy insurance, very often they underestimate this kind of risk. But now I think it has become amplified, right, by the deteriorating U.S.-China relations. So I think entrepreneurs, Chinese investors, Chinese managers, they should seriously consider this risk and factor that into their cost-benefit analysis. I mean, they will still do business. They will still list their stock on New York Stock Exchange or any other capital markets. But I think the expected rate of return has to be high enough to justify a lot of their business decisions. Yeah.
So the last question is about your next book, which is fascinating. I'm always curious about the immigration side of things. Especially in recent years in China, there is this word called "run," right? Ren. Kind of after the COVID, a lot of Chinese people really are trying to find ways to get out of China to different places. And have you witnessed any kind of really prominent changes in your research happened during the past few years? Or what is the main argument that you want to make in this upcoming work of yours?
Personally, observed more and more Chinese moving to California, and many of them will do so because they have children who are at the elementary or high school age, for their children's education. So the consequence is that they have turned California into a very competitive state for kids. But
So it means that it's harder to get into a good university in California than in a place like Wyoming.
Right. Oh, yeah, we were joking about moving to South Dakota, so that is, our kids will get into good colleges without intense competition. I can understand. I mean, it's the trend that is almost inevitable, right? On Chinese middle class, after they have accumulated enough wealth, they probably want to take some risk mitigating measures, including probably diversify their investments across different countries, maybe buying up property in different countries, and also send their kids to different countries for education. So I think the longer trend is unavoidable, right? We do see a surge of that outbound flow because of COVID. Increasingly, right, the U.S. Government has become increasingly hostile towards immigrants. So I think that would probably be a wake-up call to a lot of Chinese people who want to move to the U.S. So the global order is right now is shifting. Right, it's hard to predict. I think at least given what Trump is doing right now towards immigrants, I think a lot of Chinese middle class families will have a second thought before they decide to move to the U.S. Yeah.
So your new book or your new project will also be about changing territory, right? You are also dealing with really relevant and present questions like immigration lawyers. So
Chinese immigrants have become collateral damage in this geopolitical rivalry between U.S. and China. So at the forefront, you see a group of Chinese immigrant lawyers filing lawsuits to challenge U.S. government policies targeted at Chinese immigrants. So that this group, what they are doing, fascinates me. So that's what I'm working on. Yeah.
It's not only immigration lawyers who work with immigration files for their Chinese clients, but also they kind of file lawsuits against the U.S. government for their clients.
Yeah, so they themselves suffer, right? Once U.S. government, either federal level or state level, pass a law targeting Chinese immigrants, these lawyers, right, they lose their business, their clients suffer, their own practice are negatively implicated. So they have all the reasons to challenge all those policies or laws. On the other hand, they have the knowledge and skill set to do it. So they are playing a leadership role in this resistance against the U.S. laws and policies aimed at Chinese immigrants, or I would say discriminate against the Chinese immigrants. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to reading your new research.
Thank you.
It's also fascinating research.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time today and for sharing all the more than valuable advice. And thank you for joining us at Mapping Global China today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.